So today we're going to follow up on our previous session on the problem of evil. So today's topic is going to be that if God exists, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? Part 2.
And always remember that although this podcast is valuable for you and we've got some great things to say, neither one of us are medical doctors, psychological doctors, and we just want to make sure that we're not in legal trouble for any of that. So this advice is coming from people who love you, but we don't have those credentials.
Right. So we're not experts in those fields, not medical or legal advice.
Yeah, exactly.
There we go.
There it is.
All right. So now we've looked a little bit last time about pain and suffering and the answers available through Christian theology, like what God's doing for us, right?
Yes.
So what I wanted to do today was a little bit different. I wanted to explore a world without good and evil in it.
That'll be fun.
Right. So not that you can actually remove good and evil from the world, but I want to show, like I did in my book where I considered, well, okay, we say that, if God is good, why is there evil in the world? We're using these terms good and evil as if they have real existence. But not every worldview, not every philosophical framework provides that grounding for that.
But Mary Jo, everybody knows what good is. Everybody knows what bad is. Come on.
That's typically what people say to me.
Right?
Right? And like all of our television shows would just be just trash, and our movies if there wasn't good and evil like threaded through it. So we're all using good and evil as if they have some kind of meaningful existence as a concept. But where are we getting those things from? How are we grounding that? And so in past episodes, I've talked about how as Christians, we believe that God is our standard of goodness. Like he is what is good. He's how we know what good is. His nature is good. And because his nature is good, he does what is good. So this is like a Christian path forward. But what I want to do today is look a little bit more about, well, what if that's not your view? And that's what I was doing when I was considering I don't know if I want to believe in all this Christian stuff anymore. I don't even see people who act like it's true themselves. So why do I say I believe this? Well, one of the things that hit me was this whole idea of where am I getting this idea that things should be a certain way?
Right.
Or that in other words, there's a good way things should be, and there's a bad way that things can be. So how is that? Where have I gotten that from? And how do I ground that? And that led me to say, okay, what if there is no God? Mm-hmm. So there's no standard of good. Or what if I go to a view where there isn't? And I basically went and looked at the thing that I was combating was my former atheistic materialism. So I was sort of raised as a naturalist, looking for the natural explanations. My dad was a huge Carl Sagan fan. And so he was constantly reading that and National Geographic. And he loved space and he loved all the theories about space and the universe. So my background is more of an atheistic materialism, like the universe is all that there is. Okay. It's just material matter. There's nothing beyond that. So that's the thing that I was contrasting. If I'm going to leave Christianity, I'm probably going to go to sort of an atheistic materialism. Like there's no God, there's no spiritual realm. And that also means that I would have to take a hard look at how I know what is good and what's evil.
Mm-hmm. That's good. So yeah, I've got so many questions in my head right now. So if you're coming from an atheistic perspective, when we say good, when we say evil or bad, and we look at just nature in and of itself, we humans aren't special at all. And so when we look at Carl Sagan, we look at what's going on with his outworking, we have to understand that from an atheist perspective, we as humans don't have the specialness that we have within Christian circles.
Yeah, and I think the special is, isn't that in a Pixar movie or something, The Special?
Might have been. I don't know.
Anyway, so the special characteristic that we're referring to is our level of rationality and our moral will. Mm-hmm. That's what differentiates us out, is that we have this understanding that we are responsible.
Yes.
In a moral sense because of our rationality.
Yes. It's good. It's good.
That's the special.
The special.
It's not a peach cobbler with a steak dinner.
Ooh, that sounds good right now.
That's the other special.
I like that.
All right, so I had to consider a world without good and evil, because that's what my atheistic materialism would entail, is that These are like maybe concepts that have arisen out of evolutionary, natural selection in order for our survival, but they're not real. They're just things, they're constructs that help beings survive or something like that. So as I was looking at this whole framework of what is good and evil, how do I know what it is? I kept encountering these quotes by this Oxford biologist. Well, quotes. I kept encountering this Oxford biologist all over the internet, who is proclaiming religion as like the root of all evil, and that religion was like kind of like a virus that you give to your children. And
child abuse.
Yes, child abuse. He was really going after it. His name was Richard Dawkins. And he's sort of become like an overused name in apologetics, but that's because of some of the things that he said. So actually, he was a great person to go to, because here's this Oxford biologist. He's a Darwinian in his view of the world. And so he's going to give us a perspective. What is it like? What does it look like if you leave all view, like there is no God, and that's just the way it is? What does the universe look like then? Well, he fleshed it out.
Right
and he's
here.
not a philosopher. Just remember that. He's a biologist.
He's a biologist. So he's in science, but he's talking about philosophy.
Yeah.
So his quote is, "In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." I love that quote.
Yep.
So DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. I love that quote.
It's so great. Like he's a good writer. I will give him that. This is from his book, River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life. Okay, so he's actually trying to flesh out his his Darwinian views into his philosophy of life. And he gave us this gem of a quote, which gets passed around a lot because of its implications. Just things to point out here in this. I mean, there's so much material in just this one quote.
So much.
He says, the universe is just blind physical forces. So what he's saying is there's no intentionality and no purpose and no meaning. It's not going anywhere. It's blind, right? It's just blind. So it doesn't have intention. A lot of people are looking for meaning to their life or purpose to life, that their life has intentionality, that there's something that they can contribute. He's saying the universe is blind physical forces and genetic replication. That's at the base. And he says there's no rhyme or reason. Look at what he also says, nor any justice, right? At the base of the universe, there's no such thing as justice. Again, that means that, in our current social environment, this idea of justice is just a construct, right? It's not something that is based in anything that is real.
But that begs a question. A construct means that somebody or something or a group of people have put together something. So that's a different question.
Yeah.
Podcast.
Well, somebody might say, well, but a construct doesn't make it unreal. We're not going to get into that. But he's talking about the base of the universe. So he's like hearkening back to a philosopher, an atheist philosopher named Bertrand Russell, who had this view as well. There's no good. He keeps going here. He's like, the universe at the bottom has no design. There's no purpose, no evil, no good. There's no good or no evil. There's just blind, pitiless indifference. So no matter what happens to you in your life, the universe does not care. So sorry to Sokka in the Avatar, who says the universe just loves proving me wrong. Yeah. No, it's blind, pitiless indifference. It doesn't care if the serpent eats you, the giant sea serpent eats you or not. Also, that would be Kung Fu Panda.
Kung Fu Panda.
The universe did not bring us the Dragon Warrior. Sorry, Poe. Now, whether or not you agree with Dawkins' interpretation here of an atheistic philosophical framework, it's the one we're going to attend to, because it's the one that I was actually considering when I wrote the book.
That's good.
Like, what am I going to go to here? If I leave Christianity, what's available to me? And the one that was most attractive to me was atheism, just like get rid of all this God stuff.
Right. And just a little bit of a sidebar for me, my pastoral heart is saying, pray for Richard Dawkins. I have seen some things on Twitter as of late that make me think, well, we keep praying for these individuals who believe like this and are highly intelligent and are influencing a lot of people. Well, if they do convert to Christianity, like Anthony Flew did a few years ago, prominent atheist, Richard Dawkins as a Christian, oh man, can you imagine what would happen with that? So pray for Richard Dawkins. People who make these quotes, well, of course the Holy Spirit can reach them too. Just sidebar.
Yeah, atheist flew. Anthony Flew actually wrote a book about why he wasn't a Christian.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so he wrote, or why there is no God. He wrote a book on that, and then turns around after a debate with Gary Habermas on the evidence of the resurrection and talks about, wow, yeah, this really changed his perspective. So, he's a Richard Dawkins-esque type person that came around to belief in God. All right, so the implications of his statement.
Yes, implications of his statement where he currently is today. There's no good. There's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I mean, it's heartless. We live in a universe that we don't matter, that you don't matter, I don't matter, you don't matter. It's just, that's the reality of a statement like that.
Yeah, and what this means for our moral inclinations. We are morally inclined to believe that there are relationships and things in general that are better or worse for humankind. And he's just like torpedoing that idea. So this whole idea, like right now especially in America, we're dealing with all these ideas of racial inequality and social justice and things like that. And he's just like, boom, torpedoing that with this statement. Like, you may believe that, but at the base of the universe, it's blind, pitiless indifference. There's no justice. So, there's no way to establish that what we believe or enact in our society is actually good or evil, better or worse, just or unjust. Like, if we actually agree with this, then there's no way to establish that what we're doing does something like better mankind. I know some people would push back on me. They say, well, in your lifetime or whatever. I'm one of those people that likes to go, yeah, but where are you getting that from? Where does that idea come from?
Is it just a social construct that we've just come up with because it's making things better right now? But if that's the case, then 50 years from now, we may actually hold a reverse view of that. So we have no plumb line. We don't exactly know what we're trying to accomplish. It's just whatever the whims of the day are.
The problem is in looking at wait, there wouldn't be any good or evil. I mean, there would be things that are relatively good, like you're talking about, but that can change in 50 years, which in the history of mankind, that's on a dime. That's like
right.
No time at all. So I'm sitting here thinking, the problem is, though, none of us live that way. None of us live as if good and evil aren't real things. None of us live as if there's not things that are better and worse. And even Dawkins, in saying like religion is the root of all evil, he's using evil in his statement as if there are things that are worse and religion is one of them. He can't even get away from the morally charged language that he's trying to undercut with this statement.
That's so good.
So it's just really like none of us can get away from it. And let's put this again back into the current social issues with the negatively charged language that we use to explain the injustices that we see. We say things like bigoted, evil, racist, supremacist, privileged, and we're using those terms as if they have some kind of foundation for them, that those things are worse and there are better things, or not just worse, but they're evil, and that there is good out there to be found. He is tanking all of this with this statement. So nobody's actually going after these social issues saying, this is just relative to me. I personally think it would be great if our country could get rid of racism. Nobody means that.
They're saying there is a standard that we should all be pursuing, that it came from somewhere. We all know what it is.
Right?
We all know what it is, but
Right.
How do we know what it is and where did it come from?
Exactly. And so, that's the problem with me, with my changing over to an atheist view is I can't take the Christian philosophical framework with me and dump it into my atheist view so that I get these concepts like good and evil, just and unjust, the things that come out of a Christian philosophical framework. So the thing that even just really, as I was studying, I'm reading debates, and it's people online. So it's not like, I did some philosophers as well initially, but a lot of it was like watching people online engage with each other. And I was thinking, you are objecting to Christianity based on a moral inclination that you think it's evil or that it promotes evil, when your philosophical framework in atheism at its base has no foundation for good and evil.
Right.
Like, so it is a sort of it self-refuting, or it tears itself apart. Because it doesn't have this, but you just kind of have to shrug your shoulders and go, the world's kind of the way it is. And
so
we're all just dancing to our DNA.
So you're borrowing from the very thing that you're saying doesn't work.
Right. And this is where, like, I haven't read his book, Stealing from God.
Oh, Frank Turek, yeah.
Yeah, Frank Turek's book. But this is what I think he's getting at. And he didn't just word it like borrowing, which is a nice way of saying you're just pick and choosing, you're buffet styling your philosophical framework and saying, hey, I can make logic contradictions work in my mind because they work for me. But if you start, bringing this back out, you end up like Richard Dawkins saying, there's no good or evil in the universe, but religion is evil. That's a problem, right? You have to be logically consistent in your view.
You would hope anyway.
Yeah. So that's kind of what was really pushing me, is that I couldn't justify that there was no good and evil in the world because of the actual experiences that we have every day of this. So I know that there's good and evil. Now I had to go, where am I getting those ideas from? So I couldn't actually flip over to atheism, where there's at base, no good or evil in the universe. It's just sort of a relativistic or social construct of our people.
Well, I think it's healthy to consider things like that. So at the beginning of this podcast, you said, what if there is no God? Why do we make moral judgments on anything? What is the rationale for that? And I know there are some answers out there, but at the end of the day, they're not answers that make much sense, and they're not founded in anything that would be something that we could say, oh, that makes sense to me, I will live by that standard. Most of the atheists that I meet and that you've met are people who are always against something, but they don't ever propose something that's of a intellectual value that we can go, oh, that's why we can say there's no God. That makes sense to me. Okay, so there's no God, therefore I'm going to live by this with a moral standard, and I can be okay with myself. Right. We just don't see that. It's always the reverse: attack, all of the worldviews that are out there.
Right, and I mean, I would say, well, those aren't philosophers, right? The atheist philosophers have tried to outwork, like Nietzsche really tried to outwork his philosophies into everyday life. And, you can find those guys. For me, it's a little tough because, like, Hume and his attack against the miraculous and his attack against, sort of God in general, comes in the 1600s. So we've had like 400 years of developing atheist philosophy. And so atheists who are just like saying there is no God, but I'm not going to say what else, or not going to say how I know what's good and evil. Like, it's kind of time, if you're going to call yourself atheist, to commit to something. Like, what is your view? Is it this? Do you agree with Bertrand Russell, or are you sort of the Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, Hitchens type, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they call themselves, or the new atheists? Is that yours? Or are you more of a Nietzschean, or where do you land? Like, sort of find a framework for how you're going to describe your way of doing things.
So what is good? What is evil? That's the base of the questions of all these philosophers, and it's very difficult to discern what is meant by that at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned Frank Turek, and I do want to recommend Frank Turek. I think it's frankturek.com. I have to make sure that that's correct, but he has a lot of great resources. He's fun on stage. He's at a lot of universities. I remember when our daughter was at the University of Oklahoma, he was there. She loved his presentation. So, Stealing from God is his most recent book.
Yeah.
And he's got a ton of resources online, so check him out, frankturek.com.
Well, okay, so now I want to go to talking about the spiritual implications. We talked about, I did a lot of talking about, Richard Dawkins and all this philosophical understanding. There's also theology there because, theologians have talked about how do we know God's good, and then they'll go into the scriptures of how God describes himself, like Jesus saying, there is none good but God alone, and going back into the Old Testament, So it is a philosophical and theological question which affects us individually right there. I can just say philosophical, theological is going to affect us because we're all theologians of some stripe and we're all philosophers of some stripe. Just depends on like, well, what are we putting into that, right? So we're getting out of it what we put in. And so, but beyond that, like, okay, so we know that. Now, what are the spiritual implications? Like what do we do with this in our everyday life? How does this affect us? This knowledge that if we were to move to atheism, there's no good or evil at the base of the universe. So
I think just the very fact of understanding that we will suffer is huge. Because I think most of us are suffering avoidance. And I think if we try to avoid suffering, if that's what our goal is, we're going to live a very thin life. And I think we will go through life looking for ways to satiate ourselves instead of leaning into the suffering. And leaning into the suffering means that I know it's going to happen. I accept it. Now what do I do with it? It didn't catch me by surprise. I wasn't caught off guard by the fact because I read my Bible and I know that I'm going to suffer. And some people would say that we should rejoice in that suffering. I mentioned that earlier in the podcast, but rejoice in that suffering because Jesus suffered. If you're suffering for righteousness' sake, if you're doing things that matter in this life as a believer, you're going to suffer most likely. And we should rejoice in that we're doing things that matter in this life for the sake of Christ and for the sake of others.
Rejoicing in suffering is tough.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I was listening to him say it and I was like, yeah, that's the Christian ideal.
It sounds good.
But it's tough.
It's very tough.
Nobody wants to suffer. Nobody's going to say, wow, I really hope that I get to suffer for Christ. Now, the disciples of Christ, you see them rejoicing after being beaten and things like that because they've suffered for Christ. But that is a really hard position to take. And I'm not going to say I've ever rejoiced in suffering. When people have attacked me because of my Christian views, I'm not like, yay! That's not something that I do. But there is this, like, I like that you brought the suffering of Christ up because in suffering, there's community, right? There's this understanding that you get once you have suffered.
Yes.
In some way. Like that, people who have gone through COVID, there's a sort of a community, like I've gone through COVID and people will say, oh, did you experience this? Did you lose your taste of smell? Did you lose taste of smell?
Taste of smell.
Did you lose your sense of smell? Did you lose your taste? And in that, we're building sort of this community of COVID survivors. So in a sense, when you suffer, that you participate in a community, and the greatest participation that we have as Christians is in the suffering that God himself endured. So participation in the community of God.
That's really good.
And in his suffering for his people. I do want to say that, we focused on if there is no good or evil. And for me, the everyday life is that I have decided that there is a standard of good, that it is God. I've come to the conclusion that Jesus died because of our evil. We said we were going to cover that in this show, and we didn't. Another show. But so that's where I've come to. And how that affects me is that absolutely what I'm doing in this planet makes a difference.
Yes.
That I can absolutely choose to do what is good or what is evil. I can choose to start becoming like Christ or to become like Christ in a decision, or I can choose to move away from him. And that's in everything and all the issues that we're looking at and how we're dealing with our current world. And that's the big meta narrative, but then it applies to how I relate to my husband on a daily basis, right? It applies to marriage. So I can choose to do the things that uplift you and are good for you and are good for this relationship, or I can choose to wall up into my selfishness, be unjust in our relationship and serve myself.
That's good. Rather
than to serve you, because that's good and a beautiful thing to do. So that's how all this high philosophy and theology, like if you want to get down to nitty gritty, it does apply to your everyday choices. Do you choose to do the dishes after, he cooks the meal? Or do you just let them do it all because you're tired, right?
Right.
I mean, there's little things that can. That's just
Great example. Because I love to cook, but I don't like to clean. Ugh.
well. Anyway, that's just maybe you have a different system, but for me, that's an issue, right? So choosing to keep the cooking area clean
No, it's well said.
is an act of love, and it's something that's good versus something that is walling up into.
There's things that I
vice.
value in the house getting done that you don't, or things that you value in the house in our life getting done that I don't necessarily value. It's a matter of figuring out your spouse. What are the things that speak to them, that speak their love language? Well, once I figure that out, it'd do well for our marriage to do those things for the spouse and vice versa. So I like that. I like how this plays out into the marriage relationship. That's a good connecting point. I like that.
Should we flip it though? If there's no good or evil in the world,
What's the point?
have you ever seen?
That's a good question for a marriage.
Yeah, have you ever seen The Invention of Lying?
Yes.
It's pretty rough as far as
The
language.
language is bad, yeah.
But kudos to Ricky Gervais for actually portraying what marriage looks like outside of a covenant with a good God.
Yeah.
It's basically like, I agree to be married to you until such a time as I no longer wish to, or it's no longer beneficial to me. I mean, like, their marriage vows in there are just,
Ridiculous.
they're ridiculous. And it goes back to what Dawkins is saying. If there's no good or evil, there's no justice, there's not, then those, like, what does it matter if I commit to you or if I do what's best for me? Like, once you become difficult, maybe it's not what I want to do anymore, so I'll leave, know? I don't want to deal with cleaning up after you're cooking. Small examples. I know this is a sensitive subject for a lot of people, and we don't mean to make complete light of it. We're making light of our own relationship. But you consider that in a Darwinian view of the world, survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
And if it makes more sense for me to move on, then why wouldn't I move on?
Right.
What's holding me to the marriage relationship?
Exactly.
See, there's things like that have to be considered about good and evil, and the basis then of what that outworks into as far as human flourishing, human life. What is the good? How do we know it? What does it mean to live a good life? And then it plays into everything: religion, politics, family, everything.
Why get married in the first place? Why not just be two separate people that are cohabitating?
Right.
There's that question as well.
Right. Why have children?
Why not have children?
Right.
Yeah.
So
Same thing.
it actually plays into everything. But it takes a while. You have to think on it and then let it seep down into all of the decisions
That's good.
that you're making in life.
So, thanks for joining us today on The Pastor and the Professor. On today's episode, we discussed the problem of evil and looked at it from a vantage point where good and evil ultimately do not exist. And we even outworked it into the marriage relationship, which we didn't expect to do. So, our takeaway from today.
Oh, our takeaway is the question of pain and suffering, again, doesn't necessarily point me away from the existence of God because of all the things that implies about good and evil, right? It actually can nudge me back towards belief in God. And that's what it did for me personally, was that considering a world where there's no good or evil, there's no purpose, meaning, or intention to any of our suffering or pain, those words are only relative to individual people, because what's pain and
They're
suffering?
just words. Make the unbreakable vow. Sorry.
Sort of. I don't know who the person was that you were doing, but Bellatrix Lestrange was the actual person saying
I don't have that voice. She's a great
female voice. Is that what anyway, so just looking at that universe void of God really started to push me back to, there must be something at the base of the universe that grounds our ideas on good or evil, and that nudged me back towards the existence of God.
That's good. So for more resources, definitely go to maryjosharp.com, grab her book, Why I Still Believe. There's some other links as well. A lot of resources out there on this topic. It's a hard topic. It's very difficult. Read Job, and really read Job. There's a lot of good information on that one as well. Ecclesiastes comes to mind.
Oh yeah, and 3 and 4, where he's actually considering like the universe void of good and evil, and what this all means, and what the intent of a human's life is. Yeah.
It's excellent. So yeah, there's some great resources out there, and share this video with your friends. It's a great video too. Or tell them to join Patreon. Then they can watch it all they want.
Oh, there you go.
There we go. Thanks for joining us today on The Pastor and the Professor. I love these new glasses. Check them out.